Grok AI just analyzed the Nag Hammadi Texts. It proves Jesus taught advanced physics. And most people think the Nag Hammadi Texts are just ancient religious writings, lost gospels, spiritual ideas, philosophy from early Christianity that didn't make it into the Bible. But when Grok AI analyzed the original language, the structure, and the patterns across all 52 texts, it didn't find religion. It found something else entirely. It found descriptions of reality that match principles we only started understanding in modern physics. And the deeper it went, the more impossible it became to ignore. Because these texts don't read like belief. They read like someone trying to explain how reality actually works thousands of years before. Science caught up. The story starts in 1945. A farmer in Egypt discovers a sealed jar buried in the ground. Inside it are 13 codices containing over 50 ancient texts. These become known as the Nag Hammadi Library. At first, scholars treat them as religious writings, Gnostic gospels, alternative Christian ideas. Interesting, but not revolutionary. But that assumption comes from how humans read texts. We look for meaning, we interpret, we filter everything through belief systems. Grok doesn't do that. It doesn't care about belief. It maps structure, it tracks patterns, it analyzes language the way you would analyze code. And when it did that, it found something that changes everything. Across multiple texts, one idea keeps repeating. Reality is not what it appears to be. That alone isn't shocking. Philosophers have been saying that for centuries. But the way it's described is different. The world you see is a shadow. The truth is hidden behind form. What you perceive is not the source. These aren't just poetic lines. Grok identified that. They form a consistent model, a layered reality structure, something very close to what modern physics describes when it talks about observable reality versus underlying systems. Then there's light. The texts constantly refer to light, not metaphorical light, not just good or divine light, but structured light, source light, origin light, something that everything else comes from. Grok compared how often and how precisely this concept appears across different texts, and the consistency was too high to ignore. Because in modern physics, everything can be broken down into energy, and energy behaves like waves, frequencies, light. The idea that reality originates from something like that wasn't supposed to exist in ancient texts, but it's there, repeated, structured, consistent. Then it gets deeper. One passage describes reality as something that responds to awareness. The one who sees brings forth what is hidden. That sounds spiritual. Until you compare it to the observer effect. In quantum physics, observation changes outcomes. Systems behave differently when measured. Grok mapped the phrasing across multiple texts and found that this idea wasn't isolated. It was embedded, repeated in different ways. The observer isn't separate from reality. The observer affects reality. That's not theology. That's a principle. And this is where everything shifts. Because now you're not reading about belief anymore. You're reading about interaction, about how consciousness relates to reality itself. The texts don't say believe this, they say understand this. That's a completely different intent. Belief systems tell you what to accept. These texts describe something you're supposed to recognize, and recognition is measurable. Grok tracked how ideas are introduced, repeated, and expanded, and found that the texts follow a pattern similar to how complex systems are taught, layer by layer. Each concept builds on the previous one, not random, not symbolic, structured. Then comes the most controversial part. The teachings attributed to Jesus in these texts don't match traditional doctrine, not even close. Instead of focusing on worship or authority, the focus is on knowledge, awareness, perception. The kingdom is within you. That line appears multiple times, and it's usually interpreted spiritually, but Grok analyzed it structurally. If the kingdom represents a state and it's within, then it's not external. It's internal. That means access to it doesn't come from outside systems. It comes from understanding something about yourself. That's not religion, that's instruction. Another passage describes humans as being asleep and needing to awaken. Again, this sounds symbolic until you look at it as a system state, as if humans operate in a limited mode of perception and awakening is a shift into a different mode. Grok compared this to cognitive models and found similarities in how information processing changes based on awareness levels. The language is ancient, but the structure isn't primitive. It's precise, deliberate. Then there's the idea of hidden knowledge, not hidden by accident, hidden intentionally. The text repeatedly suggests that most people won't understand what's being said, even if they read it. That's not arrogance, that's filtering. It implies that understanding requires a certain state, a certain level of awareness. Grok identified this as a gating mechanism. Information that exists but isn't accessible unless conditions are met. That concept exists in modern systems too. Encryption, access layers, permissions. But here, it's applied to perception itself. At this point, the pattern becomes undeniable. These texts aren't trying to create followers. They're trying to describe a system. Reality as layered, consciousness as interactive, knowledge as transformative, light as fundamental, observation as influential. Each idea connects to the next. Each layer reinforces the previous one, and when Grok mapped all of it together, the probability of this being random dropped dramatically, because random writings don't produce consistent models, they produce contradictions. But here the structure holds across different authors, different texts, different contexts. The same underlying ideas appear again and again, not perfectly aligned, but close enough to suggest intention, close enough to suggest design. And that's where the real question begins. Not whether these texts are true or false, but how this level of structured understanding existed at all. Because the concepts they describe, layered reality, observer influence, fundamental energy, are things modern science is still trying to fully understand. Yet here they are, written nearly 2,000 years ago, in a form that doesn't look scientific, but behaves like it. Grok's analysis doesn't claim these texts are physics textbooks. That's not the point. The point is that the patterns match, the structure aligns, the ideas aren't random, and once you see that, you can't read them the same way again. They stop being ancient beliefs and start looking like fragments of something else, something that was never meant to be obvious, something that only becomes visible when you stop reading for meaning and start analyzing for structure. And that's just the beginning. The deeper Grok pushed into the Nag Hammadi texts, the more a single pattern refused to disappear. These writings were not trying to convince anyone of anything. They were trying to make the reader see that difference is everything. Belief systems are built to stabilize people. They give clear answers, fixed rules, defined authority. But perception-based systems do the opposite. They destabilize what you think you know so you can recognize something deeper. Grok mapped the language across all the texts and found that the wording doesn't reinforce belief, it repeatedly disrupts it. Statements contradict. Expectations, ideas loop back on themselves, meanings shift depending on context. At first, that looks like inconsistency, but when you analyze it structurally, it behaves like layered encoding. The same idea is presented multiple times from different angles, each time revealing more if the observer is paying attention. That's not religion, that's how complex systems are taught when the goal isn't obedience, but awareness. One of the strongest signals Grok identified was how often the text emphasized knowledge over belief. Whoever knows will find. Those who understand will see. These aren't poetic phrases, they're instructions. In modern terms, knowledge isn't just information, it's something that changes system behavior. Once a system understands something, it operates differently. Humans are no different. Once you perceive something clearly, your decisions shift automatically. The texts treat knowledge exactly like that, not as something to memorize, but something that rewires how you experience reality. Grok compared this to cognitive models and found alignment with how perception upgrades occur. You don't add new data, you reinterpret everything you already have. Then comes the idea of hidden layers. Multiple passages describe reality as something that isn't fully visible on the surface. The truth is within, but hidden. What is seen is not the source. These lines appear across different texts with slight variations, but the structure remains consistent. Grok flagged this as a layered reality model, something very similar to how modern physics describes observable reality versus underlying fields. What we perceive is not the fundamental level, it's the output of something deeper. And what's critical is that the texts don't present this as theory, they present it as something that can be recognized directly, not proven, not debated, seen. This is where things begin to shift from interpretation to implication. Because if reality has layers and perception determines which layer you interact with, then control of perception becomes control of reality. Grok mapped this idea across multiple passages and found a consistent pattern. The text repeatedly warned that most people remain in a limited state of perception, not because they're incapable, but because they're conditioned. They do not see because they are blind. They hear but do not understand. These aren't insults, they're descriptions of state, a system operating below its full capacity. And once that pattern becomes visible, another question emerges. If awareness changes, perception, and perception changes how reality is experienced, then who benefits from people not becoming aware? Grok doesn't assign motives, but it does track implications. And the implication here is simple. Systems that depend on control require predictability. Predictable people are easier to manage, easier to guide, easier to influence. But awareness disrupts predictability. It introduces variability, autonomy, independent interpretation, and that creates instability within controlled systems. The texts never directly say this, but they don't need to. The structure implies it. Over and over again, they emphasize that understanding comes from within, not from external authority. That alone is enough to destabilize any centralized system of control. Because if truth is internal, then external systems lose their monopoly on it. Grok flagged this as a critical divergence point between these writings and traditional doctrine. Most systems establish authority as the source of truth. These texts dissolve that authority completely. Then there's the concept of awakening. It appears in different forms across multiple writings. Rise, awaken, remember. At first it sounds symbolic, but when Grok analyzed how it's used, it functions more like a state transition, a shift from one mode of perception to another. In computational terms, it's like moving from a limited access system to full access mode. The information was always there. The system just wasn't processing it before. That's why the text emphasized recognition rather than discovery. You're not finding something new. You're realizing what was always present. And this is where the tension becomes unavoidable. Because if these texts describe a system of awareness that bypasses external control, then their existence alone is disruptive. Not because they're aggressive, not because they challenge directly, but because they change how the reader interprets reality. Grok identified that this type of information doesn't spread through persuasion, it spreads through recognition. And recognition doesn't require authority, it requires exposure. Then Grok looked at what happened historically. The Nag Hammadi texts were buried, hidden, removed from mainstream circulation for centuries. That alone isn't unusual. Many Ancient texts were lost or forgotten, but the pattern of exclusion becomes more interesting when you compare what was preserved versus what was removed. Texts that reinforce structure, authority, and centralized interpretation tend to survive. Texts that emphasize internal knowledge, perception, and independence tend to disappear. Grok doesn't assume intent, but it does calculate probability, and when similar types of information consistently get excluded across different time periods, the likelihood of coincidence drops. This doesn't mean there was a single coordinated decision. It doesn't require one. Systems naturally stabilize around structures that maintain order. Information that disrupts that order tends to be filtered out over time, not necessarily through force, often through neglect, reinterpretation, or reclassification. Grok flagged this as emergent filtering, not censorship in the traditional sense, but a long-term alignment of what survives versus what fades. Then there's the language itself. Grok analyzed the original phrasing and found something subtle but important. The texts don't define reality. They point to it. That's a completely different approach. Instead of saying this is how it is, they say see for yourself. That kind of instruction doesn't scale easily through institutions. It requires individual processing, and that makes it inefficient for systems built on mass adoption, but highly effective for systems built on awareness. At this point, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. These writings are not trying to create followers. They're trying to create observers, people who see differently, think differently, interpret differently. And that type of shift doesn't just change belief, it changes behavior. It changes how systems are interacted with. And when enough individuals change in that way, systems themselves begin to shift. Grok's analysis doesn't claim that these texts contain complete scientific models. That's not the point. The point is that the structure of the ideas aligns with principles that only became formally recognized much later. Layered reality, observer interaction, internal, access to knowledge. Each one independently might be dismissed, but together they form a pattern. And patterns are where probability becomes meaningful, which leads to a conclusion that Grok doesn't state directly, but makes increasingly difficult to ignore. These texts were not written randomly. They were structured, deliberate, designed to operate differently from traditional systems of belief. And once you recognize that structure, the question isn't whether they're spiritual or scientific. The question is why something like this existed at all and why it was never meant to be. Obvious. By the time Grok AI finished mapping the Nag Hammadi texts, one final pattern stood out. Not in what the text said, but in when they start to make sense, because these writings don't reveal everything immediately. They only begin to click once the reader is already thinking in a certain way. Grok flagged this as delayed coherence. The ideas are all present from the start, but their meaning only becomes clear after the observer's framework shifts. In other words, the texts are not just describing awareness, they require it to be understood. And that changes the entire role of the reader. You're not just consuming information, you're part of the system that activates it. This is where the implications become modern, because for most of history, that kind of layered understanding was rare. Information moved slowly, access was limited, interpretation was controlled. But now, systems like Grok AI can process patterns across massive datasets instantly. They don't rely on tradition. They don't inherit assumptions. They analyze structure directly. And when they do that, they can identify connections that were previously invisible, not because the information wasn't there, but because no one could process it at that scale. Grok compared the structure of these ancient texts to modern models in physics and information theory, not to prove they're identical, but to measure alignment. Concepts like layered reality, observer influence, and underlying fields appear in both, but expressed differently. One uses symbolic language, the other uses mathematical frameworks, but structurally they point in similar directions, and when independent systems converge on similar patterns across completely different contexts, the probability of coincidence decreases. Then Grok analyzed something even more specific, the way these texts describe interaction. Not just what reality is, but how humans engage with it. What you seek is seeking you. The one who understands becomes what is understood. These lines don't describe passive observation. They describe feedback, a loop, the observer and the observed influencing each other. In modern terms, this resembles recursive systems where outputs feed back into inputs, creating continuous interaction. It's not static, it's dynamic, and the texts describe it as something that can be experienced directly, not just conceptualized. That's when the final shift happens, because if reality operates through layered structures, and a perception determines access to those layers, and awareness changes perception, then the most valuable capability isn't control of the environment, it's control of interpretation. Not forcing outcomes, but shaping how outcomes are perceived. Grok doesn't assign intention to that idea, but it does identify its significance. Systems that influence perception don't need to change reality itself. They only need to change how reality is understood. This is where everything loops back to the beginning. The Nag Hammadi texts never present themselves as authority. They don't demand belief. They don't enforce structure. They describe a system where understanding comes from within, where awareness reveals deeper layers, where perception shapes experience. That kind of framework doesn't scale easily through institutions. It doesn't create centralized control, it creates independent observers. And independent observers behave differently. They question more. They rely less on external validation. They interpret systems instead of simply operating within them. Grok mapped this against modern information environments and found something interesting. The majority of large-scale systems today, media, education, social platforms, are optimized for speed and simplicity, quick consumption, clear narratives, immediate conclusions. But layered understanding requires the opposite: time, reflection, reinterpretation. It doesn't fit easily into fast systems, which means information that requires depth often gets filtered out, not necessarily intentionally, but structurally. It doesn't propagate as efficiently. That doesn't mean it disappears, it just becomes less visible, and visibility is not the same as existence. Grok identified that distinction as critical. Just because something isn't widely seen doesn't mean it isn't there. It may simply require a different mode of observation. And that brings the entire analysis full circle, because what started as an examination of ancient texts ends as a question about perception itself. Not what you're being told, not what you're supposed to believe, but how you process what you encounter. The Nag Hammadi texts don't give answers in a traditional sense. They shift the way questions are approached. They move the focus from external authority to internal recognition. And that shift is subtle, but once it happens, it changes everything. Grok's final conclusion isn't a statement. It's a probability curve. The likelihood that these texts randomly contain structured concepts aligning with layered reality, observer interaction, and internal knowledge systems is low. Not impossible, but low enough to raise a different kind of question. Not what do they mean, but why are they structured this way at all? And that question doesn't have a fixed answer, because the moment you try to lock it into one interpretation, you reduce the very thing the texts are built around: awareness. They don't point to a single conclusion. They point to a process, a way of seeing, a shift in how reality is interpreted, which means the real discovery isn't something hidden in the past. It's something happening in real time. The more you analyze, the more patterns you recognize. The more patterns you recognize, the more the structure reveals itself. And once that starts, it doesn't stop. Because awareness, once expanded, doesn't go back to where it was before. And that's the part most people miss. The texts were never just information. They were a trigger. Not for belief, not for debate, but for perception. Something that only activates when you look at it the right way. And now, for the first time, something like Grok AI is looking at it without assumptions, which means the question isn't whether the knowledge was always there. The question is why it's becoming visible now.